Good evening and welcome to our 2021-22 season finale. My name is Jim Bensley and I'm the Interim Director of the Northwestern Michigan College International Affairs Forum. Tonight's Foreign Policy Mashup features CEO and President of the World Affairs Councils of America, Mr. Bill Clifford. In addition, we also have two very special local panelists who I'll introduce to you a bit later. Following this evening's discussion, please stick around as we will reveal our fall 2021 speaker lineup. In the meantime, feel free to post questions for Bill in the chat box located at the bottom of your screen. We have a lot to unpack in the next hour, so we'll try and get to as many questions as we can, but please realize we probably won't be able to address all of them. This evening's format will begin with a statement from Bill, followed by a number of questions from our panelists. About 2/3 of the way through and into the program, we'll begin taking audience questions. So now let me introduce you to our speaker. Bill Clifford is President and CEO of World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, D.C., where he leads WACA's national office and represents its nonpartisan, nonprofit network of more than 90 World Affairs Councils across the United States. In March 2017, he was appointed non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins Paul H. Neitz School of Advanced International Studies. Before joining WACA in September 2013, Bill spearheaded the revitalization and growth of World Boston, a WACA member council known for innovative programming, access to leaders, and a tradition of advancing public learning about critical international issues. Previously, Bill served as Asia Bureau Chief for the pioneering multimedia venture CBS MarketWatch, where he launched and directed news bureaus in Japan and Hong Kong. He got his start in broadcast news with Asia Business News TV and was senior correspondent in Tokyo for CNBC Asia after its merger with ABN. Bill began his work in journalism, reporting on international economics, finance, and politics for several newspapers. In 2019, he was appointed as a member of the Korea Economic Institute of America's Advisory Council. Bill holds an MA from Johns Hopkins, a BA summa cum laude in International Relations and French Literature from Tufts University, and a CEP from Sciences Po in Paris. Thank you, Bill, and welcome to tonight's program.
Jim, thank you very much for your warm introduction. It's always wonderful to be with councils and to have my first interaction programmatically with the International Affairs Forum in Traverse City. I'm appreciating the chance to be with you virtually. I think this meeting, if I'm not mistaken, was planned a year or even two ago that I would visit in person. And I hope that if I do my job today, I'll get an invitation back so I can see your community in person. Thanks so much. I just want to open with a few table setting remarks because I really prefer a conversation with the panel and have the questions of the attendees, and I'm delighted that you've shown up for this. As Jim said, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit network of 90 World Affairs Councils across the country. And that means we're in red states and blue states and mostly in larger cities. And it can mean, therefore, that our constituents are perhaps more internationalist than not. And that may give an impression of having a certain leaning one way or the other politically, but we really strive, as I know the forum does in Traverse City, to present a range of perspectives. I have found this to be especially challenging over the last 4 years. And so I just want to say I have an open mind about other people's views. I'm always willing to incorporate new information and test my ideas and opinions and change them. So if I say something that seems challenging to you, it will only be intellectually. It has nothing to do with you as a person. I want all of us to be able to talk civilly all the time. Okay, so with that, we've just had an incredible week of diplomacy. So the timing of this mashup is perfect. President Biden has gone to Europe for several summits, starting with the G7 and the EU and NATO, and of course his meeting one-on-one that the world was waiting for with Putin of Russia. And in addition, Vice President Kamala Harris made her first visit to Latin America and to discuss the key issue of immigration, of which she's been named by the president as his lead person on that issue. I think what we have seen in the first 100 or so days of this administration is quite a contrast to what came before, not only in preparation, in tone, in focus. It is a, you could say that Trump had a doctrine, American first and America first, and put in ideas behind that. I think it was more, it sort of came about as time went on rather than sort of a specific agenda. And I think this is a little different. What I would use often is the prefix re, whether it's restoring, repairing, renewing, revitalizing, reimagining, refocusing, becoming more reliable would be the final re. What the president's team has said about describing the refocusing is a US foreign policy for the middle class. And what I would say undergirds all of this, whether you agree with the priorities, whether you agree with the policies or disagree with them, one thing is very clear that I think anybody on right or left can accept, and that is the domestic international connection of the world that we're living in today. And especially for the United States, everything that is happening at home will have an impact overseas and vice versa. There's just it's almost like there is not even blurring. It's one and the same. And in a speech by Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, in early March, he outlined 8 priorities, which I'd like to share with you. And I've ordered them differently. I'm not sure when he was announcing them that they were in an order of priority 1 down to priority 8. I think it was just more of a less of a list. But the way I look at them, I've tried to structure them a little bit for my own mind, and maybe this will be interesting to you. First of all, there are 2 crises of the here and now. And these are important, perhaps the most important priorities, in the sense that this is what I think the last election was about. On the one hand, there's COVID-19 and global health security as a priority and as an electoral reality. President Trump and his administration did not tell the truth about the pandemic, and worse, the handling of it and the early reopening and the politicizing of aspects of the handling of the pandemic and where individual states were and the health of our population was a disaster. And it was not up to the standard that either the United States citizenry nor the rest of the world would expect. Worse, we withdrew from the WHO during COVID at a time of a global pandemic when everyone, every nation together matters, that disease can travel across borders. We can't isolate ourselves. So COVID-19 and global health security is a priority, and preparing for the next pandemic equally so, because as we see already, variants are happening, and there is the likelihood that we could all suffer another pandemic, and it would be a shame not to learn from this one. Secondly, the other main crises and the other top priority is strengthening democracy. The election was largely in part of reflecting faith in democracy, and nothing showed that more than after the election, the January 6th insurrection revealed to us and the world how ailing our democracy is and the ongoing tragedy of one party adhering to conspiracy theories is wreckage for the country. We need two functioning parties. We need the push and pull that comes from that to be responsible to the American public. There are two major global challenges of our time that have been identified not only by this administration, but its forerunners. The climate crisis and driving green revolution is the most pressing human demand because it's the survival of the planet. Although we behave that it can be put off forever. We've been trying to decarbonize for 30 years at least, and our government has been lacking whoever's in the White House and Congress. China. Meeting the diplomatic, ideological, geopolitical test of our time means managing this most consequential relationship. There is an area where bipartisanship can flower. We're seeing it line up, and the big question, I think, is, as we've seen over these last several days, where democracies, leaders of democracies are coalescing around what China's rise means. I think the threading the needle is going to be whether China is regarded as a determined competitor and is managed and contained or strategically engaged, or whether it becomes an existential foe, in which case there's a new Cold War, and it's really difficult to imagine that not being a highly conflicted world. Now, from these four, particularly strengthening democracy and managing China and autocracy, we in this country are able to express through our foreign policy American values. And to the world, the choice is, do we want to be more like the United States, or do we want to be more like China? And I believe, regardless of who I voted for or didn't vote for, Joe Biden emerged as president. He's Joe from Scranton. He's also the former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's both ordinary and elite. He didn't go to an Ivy League college, but he speaks a language that people understand as straight, and he therefore brings a certain credibility not only to the public, but also to our international partners, that when he says America's back, people are going to accept that to a point. When he's got to justify it through actions. When he says, we're creating a US foreign policy for the middle class, this public, our public, can understand that. The language is really important. When he talks about the fifth foreign policy priority, sustainable, inclusive, global economy that works for American families and workers, he's appealing to the progressives in his own party, sustainable, inclusive. He's using the words American families and workers. He's a labor guy. He's for kitchen table issues. It is not American first. It's not incendiary, but it flows from the idea that we're going to prioritize American interests and we're going to serve the electorate. It's a form of code. Trump also spoke a form of code, but it was a divisive code. And it put off allies. 6, shoring up alliances, multilateral institutions and partnerships is critical, more as a means in some ways to handling the upper 5 priorities, but it's also a goal in itself. Looking at the 70 years since World War II, there's been incredible stability, incredible prosperity. There were no great power conflicts that erupted into a World War III or something approaching it. the denigration of alliances that happened over the last 4 years, whether it's NATO obsolete, whether it's hinting that South Korea should fend for itself, did enormous damage to our position, our image, as did what happened on January 6th. It means that the repair work is the language behind the repair work, the going to Brussels and not throwing Starburst or Skittles at one of your counterparts of a leading democracy. This stuff matters. Optics matter, the language matters, and the substance of putting things in the communique, such as we're going to be aligned against the malign behavior of Russia, that we're going to be assembling policies that are in concert around China, that we are going to tackle climate change, that we are going to together harmonize policies to the extent possible in trade and monetary and fiscal policies with the infrastructure bill to boost our economy so prosperity is shared across democracies, and that also that we become a model for good behavior, if you will. So having a seat at the table, responding to what is a yearning for US leadership, as the French would say, as partnership, not telling us what to do, but being leaders and partners, will go a long way to easing what will still be there for months and months ahead, which is the lingering fear that this may not last, that we may have a relapse, that we may find ourselves again in the throes of populism. They're paying attention to our domestic politics as we should theirs. 7 is securing US technological leadership. There's a good opportunity for bipartisanship here as well. It relates to the economy, it relates to climate, it relates to China. It undergirds American soft power. Also raises the question of the role of big tech in democracy, and there we have some challenges certainly confronting the administration. President Biden has recently appointed law professor Lina Khan as the head of the Federal Trade Commission, which will be responsible for regulating in this area, and she has been very critical of the big tech powers. So that's interesting. But generally speaking, one thing that's important: you can't have a U.S. technological leadership if you're denigrating science and if you're anti-intellectual. We have to have an effective system, an effective educational system that brings opportunity and that promotes and advances scientific inquiry and celebrates facts. Last but not least, immigration. The goal is building a humane and effective system for migrants and refugees. We had an interesting tack back from campaign language with Vice President Harris's visit, particularly in Guatemala, when she said, no, don't come, tell the refugees, tell the migrants, no, we will turn them back, which is not quite aligned with what some progressives in the party thought would be a more humane approach. She was challenged by Lester Holt on television to explain why she didn't visit the border, and a lot of people didn't think her answer was very compelling. Also, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez tweeted that, part of the migrant problem is, our own hands are in it for creating years and decades of hardship through our policies to the region. And therefore, if we don't address these root causes and welcome people who are coming because they're fleeing dangerous situations and hardship that the U.S. has in some ways had a role in, then we're hypocrites. So it's going to be a frustrating time for the White House to navigate between the progressive wing of its own party and certainly the Republican Party, which will be very vocal about what they see as a muddy policy and their own views on immigration. So with that outline of really 8 huge items that are on the agenda, we at the World Affairs Councils of America have a national conference coming up November 16 to 19 in Washington. We plan to be in person again. And I think that underscoring the domestic international connection of all these issues and putting up speakers, keynoters, panelists, think tank experts on these 8 and more, because we can't predict the future. There will be other challenges, will be a very productive way to look at 1 year of the administration and what's ahead. Thank you. Jim?
Thank you, Bill. It's very informative. Appreciate you sort of laying that out. Let me jump right in and introduce our other panelists this evening. But before I do that, let me also tell the audience that we will not have a hard stop at 6 o'clock. I want to make sure that your voices are heard. We get a chance to answer a number of questions and have this conversation. So I think if that's all right with you, Bill, we can go a few minutes after.
Sure.
We'll give folks a chance to, again, say their piece. So we have with us Karen Puschel Segal. She's a former State Department official and intelligence analyst specializing in Russian affairs. With her husband, Jack, they established in 1994 the first U.S. consulate in Western Siberia, a vast region of 40 million people. Karen is a Council on Foreign Relations scholar and is the author of U.S.-Israeli Strategic Cooperation in the Post-Cold War Era, as well as numerous articles on Soviet arms control policy. From 2012 to 2019, Karen led the International Affairs Forum here in Traverse City. And I've known Karen for the past 8 years and have admired her, not only her past work with IAF, but also her engagement with the Traverse City community. She's someone who has a strong desire to help inform the region on the ever-changing complexities of the world in which we live. So thank you, Karen, for being here. Nick Beadleston is the founding partner at Good Impacts, a niche mission-driven business consulting firm which specializes in supporting small and mid-sized businesses. Their raison d'etre is to help guide those organizations and industries which are awakening to their incalculable potential for social and environmental good, and as a result, are pivoting towards community service and sustainability as the new metrics of profitability. Nick is also a former paratrooper, having deployed twice with the 82nd Airborne. He's also written for numerous news and cultural publications and has served as outreach director and sometimes impromptu field guide for the International Coffee Community NGO On the Ground. His voice today represents what many World Affairs Councils refer to as young professionals, people roughly between the ages of 25 and 40 who harbor an energetic desire to develop solutions for a better community and a better world. This is also the segment of the populations which many councils have trouble reaching. So, Karen and Nick, thank you for being here. Karen, let's begin with a question from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. I'm happy to be here. And Bill, really enjoyed your introduction and setting up today's discussion. And I guess as representing the old generation, and we'll be excited to hear from the younger generation when Nick speaks up. So delighted to have him on board as well. So Bill, it seems to me if we could just look at the big picture of what President Biden's trip to Europe was all about. And when he was talking about America is back, what he was really saying is that he has a commitment to maintaining the post-World War II order. And we might say, well, of course he does. But in fact, that has been in doubt over the last 5-6 years, whether those tenets are crumbling and not really being sure what is going to replace it. And in fact, he explicitly hearkened back to the meeting between FDR and Churchill in 1941. And when they laid out the principles for nations united against fascism, and nations united eventually became the United Nations that were the nations fighting against Hitler. So there was a clear enemy that we could coalesce around, and that we could work together towards defeating. And that was so important to the building of that post-war structure. But today, when we think about what it means, I'm wondering, the commonality depends a bit more on amorphous challenges, including challenges in our own homes. So I'm wondering first, before we talk about specific challenges and threats that we see, what do you see as the bipartisan support for Biden? Like even just over the last few days, as he has been on the world stage, has he enjoyed kind of support from both sides of the aisle? Does he have to come back and get something through Congress to actually make some of his initiatives take place? Well, what's happening?
Well, I think the best example of bipartisanship happened prior to this summitry of the recent 7 or 8 days, and that was when the Senate passed an industrial bill to really bolster U.S. industry and technology, focused on our competition with China. And a lot of money is going to be funneled into the semiconductor industry in particular, to maintain its leadership and to invest in research and so forth. And I think that bill, which I believe passed 68 to 32, suggests that when there is a challenge of the nature that China represents, that Congress can come together. But we're not seeing that same bipartisanship in the infrastructure bill, which contains a goodly proportion of funding for green incentives. And really, originally, I think in the context of the president's American Jobs Plan, which was set at $2 trillion, the administration is trying to produce a number that I think would attract more Republicans to come its way. But right now, that bill is not moving fast. And I'm not sure we're going to see a repeat of what we saw in the Senate on the technology and industrial front. Internationally, I think not everyone will say it, because the other party, there's a lot of fear there for what can come from a Donald Trump press conference or what have you. I'm sure folks like Lindsey Graham, for example, who used to be very much a classic hawk who wanted to see America's engagement in the world, privately would regard what's going on as what you would expect of the United States, to interact with world leaders, to present our vision. I mean, really, the items on the G7 agenda that was the U.S. agenda, that was the Biden agenda, and I think what we saw, what was demonstrated, is that the advanced market economies are meeting together with giving the impression of some unity. That was not the case in the last 4 years.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly, I think there was just such a sense of relief of having the civility and the normalcy as leaders met. Boris Johnson, he kind of delightedly said, "Oh, it was like meeting old friends from school again," and so that kind of set the tone for that sense of, oh yes, we know each other and nobody's going to kind of go out of line, and that was clearly an atmosphere that was very important. But it also seemed to be the case for when Biden met Putin. I mean, again, they seem to get along. They were not there wasn't any of the drama that people kind of predicted going into it. And in fact, going into the meeting, I heard a lot of hyperbole. I would call it hyperbole about red lines from both
Oh,
Putin and Biden, that, what the US should do to threaten, if the cybersecurity attacks don't stop, if the election meddling continues, if the human rights abuses continue with Navalny. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as actually coming out of that meeting? Did we kind of move beyond the rhetoric, and did we move to a better place in the relationship?
I don't know about a better place, but I think boring is probably good at this stage. We had an arms control agreement in jeopardy that has been extended. And before this meeting, I think it was really to take the measure of each other. It was positive probably for Putin to be acknowledged as a great power. And Biden, I feel, is a realist about this. He's observed symmetry going back decades and knows that, there is atmospherics. I read that, Putin showed up ahead of him. Typically, he would insult somebody by being late and so forth. And so, not that these things really matter at the end of the day. I mean, Biden knows insults better than anybody, having been through the campaign that he just was. So that's all stuff. But the fact of the matter is, there are serious issues dividing us. Russia is a disruptor. It's identified in the national security strategy, rightly by Trump's administration, as a power that is antithetical to what we want and a challenger. The president himself didn't behave as such, the last president, but there are arms control issues, cybersecurity issues, the ransomware attacks that you mentioned that have to be pressed, but these can be addressed in lower level meetings, as you know, that there can be that pressure. And if there is another huge attack on the US, I don't think we're going to have a boring response. This is a meeting to sort of, I think, between them, get the issues on the table. There are common ones that will be helpful for that the United States has to compartmentalize around, such as the Arctic and other aspects of climate, the Iran nuclear discussions, which are taking place in Vienna. We could benefit from having Russia's influence if it's presented helpfully. The diplomats that were expelled are going to come back. We'll see if Biden decides to lift some of the many sanctions that even he has imposed on top of Trump's. So the last but not least, I think Putin is facing some real political challenges in some ways. If he is behaving the way he has, if the repression against Navalny and opposition is such as it is, it reflects, I think, stress. And to the extent that becomes leverage for the US, that's good.
Yeah, and in fact, if I could just add one personal note, and then we'll turn to other issues. But for people just to realize how bad relations have been, is in the past year, well, of course, 2 years ago, St. Petersburg consulate was closed. This past year, just in the past few months, Yekaterinburg, that Jack and I opened 27 years ago, was closed. Vladivostok was closed. The embassy Moscow was drawn down to such an extent that it was a bare bones staff. And so, you know, this has been unprecedented, and really shocking. It's almost madness to think that two great powers could have so little people doing their business. And so as they now talk about having strategic stability talks and sending the ambassador back, I at least hope that they can also start issuing visas again and start doing the daily business of the relationship, because it's shocking how bad it's gotten.
Yes, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think Biden has asked Ambassador Sullivan to stay on. Do you know? I should know this, but Trump's ambassador would normally have just come and been replaced. But I think that that he's respected, and I think that there is a focus there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think there is a realization that both sides have made that relations, as you point out, are seemingly as bad as they've been in decades, and they could get worse. But if what came out of this was a sense of measure and a sense that there are issues that can be worked on, and that these contacts, it happened during the Cold War too, that there were opportunities to engage the country in ways that prevented certainly in the latter Cold War crises.
So thank you for adding that bit of information there. That's very informative. Nick, let me swing it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure that a white guy rapidly hurtling toward middle age definitely represents the current generation or the ones behind me. We're definitely looking at some of the most diverse in every sense of the word generations that our already really diverse country and culture has ever seen.
I thought you were referring to me rapidly hurtling toward middle age.
Absolutely. That's what I was going for, Bill. But I feel confident saying that my generation and some of the ones behind us are unified by some shared values. And one of those is concern around climate change. It's such an overarching issue. And yeah, who shows up to the summit first doesn't really matter. When we've got such dire global environmental consequences. And you talked at the top of the hour, Bill, about some of those really important re's that the U.S. is now dealing with, including reliability. And given our last administration's willingness to pull out of the multilateral climate agreement, albeit a non-binding one, what does this really mean for U.S. leadership in climate work moving forward?
Well, being back in Paris is a plus. Looking ahead to the November meeting in Glasgow is essential to set goals, and countries will underscore commitments and targets and want to bring things to that that I think show, to the extent that they're pursuing a responsible path toward addressing this intense, immense challenge. We're seeing probably, in my view, not enough from the administration on this. I'm very passionate about this issue, even though I'm not your generation. I think when we're facing the potentially the extinction of species at a rapid rate, when our temperatures are rising, and it's going to have devastating effects on livelihoods, on housing, on where people live, on conflicts over water and so forth. Not just around the world, but it will come to this country too. We need to get ahead of this game and not be and not just sort of try to catch up to it. In the infrastructure bill, or the infrastructure part of the American Jobs Plan, there are a range of incentives in the form of tax credits, subsidies, commitments to investing in electric vehicles, in purchasing them, in trying to get electricity targets by 2035 to a certain level, net zero carbon by 2050. To do this, I believe those actions, while they're good, they're on the carrot side of the equation. There really needs to be some disciplining sticks, and that would be a carbon tax or something like it, where that companies all around are, or even individuals are forced to pay for the carbon they put out, and that will be a stronger driver to get us to the goals that people have expressed at the COP summits and whatnot. So in that sense, money and positive incentives are one thing, but there needs to be that stick that I don't think is there, and that may come across as wildly liberal to some people. But when you put this in the context of the disaster relief that we're going to be spending on a regular basis, the bailouts to communities that are afflicted by climate incidents, the human migration that will result in our hemisphere, for example, those costs are going to be equal to or more than what we could generate now if we put in what I would argue would be more responsible policies that regulate us in a good way.
In fact, Bill, I really wonder if Biden missed an opportunity during his trip to not talk about climate change. And I realize he's probably waiting for, you know, what's coming in the fall, but you know, again, going back to him harking back to the coalition of United Nations, and you need an enemy for that, right? And we don't really have an enemy. Russia, China even doesn't even come close to what we were looking at for Hitler or something else. But the enemy we do have, the existential enemy, is climate change. And I do feel like somehow we missed that opportunity to get that fixed in people's minds. Like even today, I heard Chuck Hagel giving an interview, and they were, well, who's the greatest threat? You know, is it Russia? Is it China? And I would have liked to have heard him say, yeah, I mean, we have to manage these relationships, but the greatest threat we're facing is climate change. And he didn't say that because the agenda wasn't defined that way.
That's interesting, because as the former defense secretary, the Pentagon has come out with some very serious research on what, you know, our military recognizes this as an existential threat. And that will provide its own kind of discipline in policy. But I think yes, I suppose more could have been said, and I would have welcomed that too. But I think that in some ways, he did convene an Earth Day summit that addressed the issue head on, and maybe felt that that was the expression of the, not that it doesn't bear a constancy because of the nature of the threat, but that this was about other things perhaps, and that it's not disappearing from his agenda. I'm not trying to defend him. I'm just wondering if that may be the explanation.
So we talked about an opportunity lost, and I know we have other topics to get to, but how, Bill or Karen, how can we start to personify that climate change threat? I mean, we can't slap fatigues on it. You know, we do well against conventional armies, but how can we start to personify it, either in our rhetoric or in our actions?
Karen,
Oh,
I would
Bill,
allow you to jump in. I don't want to invaded states.
I think Biden is, in his whole trip overseas, was so carefully crafted, and I really do think he has an excellent, outstanding team that coordinates, and that is something we did not have with President Trump, who wanted to, keep everything directly in his own hands. And so I do think they're really effective. So I assume there must have been a decision on their part of why not to do that. Is it because they know that it would have raised hackles on the other side of the aisle back home, or did they really think that maybe who they were talking to, it would have been controversial? I honestly don't know, but I think it's partly a matter of just defining it all of the time as the greatest threat that is facing us at this time. There's just no question of that.
Great,
There's
thank
always
you. Yes,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, but that'll certainly be something that's with us for a number of years. And I think, yes, the sooner we can address it in a more succinct way, in a more cooperative way, is going to be incredibly important. In fact, that I'm sure will be a topic for the International Affairs Forum for the next 5 or more years as we go through this. So thank you, Nick, for that question. Karen, let me go back to you for another question. I know we've heard that big red word, China, come up. Do you have something regarding that place in the world?
Well, actually, Bill, this is an area where, yes, our policy or our approach to China does enjoy bipartisan support. And I guess whenever everybody kind of globs on, I always get a little nervous about that. And I did find it interesting that it was Angela Merkel during the G7 meetings that basically said, maybe we shouldn't overestimate the dangers posed by Beijing, that China is indeed a rival, but also a partner. And I think that China is also extraordinarily complicated because so many of the foreign policy issues are, from China's perspective, domestic issues. If you look at Hong Kong and Taiwan and the South China Sea, all of these things that we have very strong feelings on as well. But for them, it's not just foreign policy, it's domestic. So, I'm just wondering, I think there's a tendency when everybody kind of jumps on board that it gets rolling in some ways, and it can almost start creating a self-fulfilling result with it, and that just concerns me a little bit. But I know that I think you think that we are doing a really good job on China, so I just throw it back to you.
I'd say a better job. I'm not sure about a really good job yet. There were actions after World War II that we could see Russia emerging as a major foe, and so the Allies, led by the U.S., got busy on institutions and treaty arrangements and the like to build the order that we had to defend our ideals and values. And right now we're not sure this is just a very large, rich, military modernizing country, or if it's going to turn itself into an aggressive force that's going to need repelling. And where it's shown greater aggression is in its own region. And I think there's probably different attitudes in this country and in our leadership about how to respond to that. I think certainly we need to engage China on all the levels that we can. We shouldn't shy away from talking about Hong Kong or the Uyghurs or these kinds of issues, because those are our values, and that messaging is not just us to them, it's us to the world and other countries that we want to stand by us. You said something very interesting, which is Merkel's comment, and I think there is some room between, European powers, although the UK, I think, has gone from being a bit naive as maybe you could say Clinton to Trump were naive about China in hindsight. Didn't seem to be, maybe in real time. But I think, Boris Johnson, was like, China, they just want to do business. And in some ways, Trump had that attitude even as he was slapping on tariffs, but they don't just want to do business. And so that's why I think you have the emergence of what I think is trying to get people under the same umbrella on China, and Merkel and maybe Macron, not so much. They want to be able to deal as independent countries would. But there was this outcome of a rival infrastructure plan, Build Back Better, BBB 3 world, whatever that tortured acronym is, Build Back Better world, where wealthy nations are going to invest in and provide access to investment capital to help countries around the world develop and answer the infrastructure needs that they have. We have them too at home, but there's a huge $40 trillion gap in infrastructure needs that needs filling. And China, as I'm sure people at the forum know, has since 2013, when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, has been trying to win hearts and minds by offering speedy loans to all manner of countries, which started out as just an Asian region, the Maritime Silk Road and the belt that goes through Central Asia into Europe. But now China's, even Italy and other countries in Latin America have signed up to BRI, and I think there's an interest in rivaling that. We can talk about the trade agreement matters too, that are competitive and that the U.S. kind of let go of, and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has evolved, which China is joining. When you're working to create standards and deliver, for all agreements have flaws, but when you're working to deliver that kind of prosperity and also have a geopolitical edge to it that you give up, it's a loss.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for excuse me. Thank you for laying that out. Nick, let's go to you for one more question, then we'll take some audience questions following yours.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great softball question, Bill. We're obviously seeing a really important social justice movement unfolding in the U.S. right now, and the Black Lives Matter movement is both informed by and is informing other social justice movements around the world. What do you think, zooming out a little bit, and it's always hard when we're right in the middle of something, but zooming out a little bit, what do you think is the enduring legacy of the Black Lives movement on sort of that global arc of the universe toward justice?
That's a really good question. I wonder about the legacy here in this country, given that we had a civil rights movement in the 60s that produced landmark legislation, and here we are 50, 60 years later, struggling with these same issues and having these same difficult conversations that seem to suggest that progress has been so limited, so that as inspiring as protests go, oftentimes you need structure, you need governance, you need, institutional resiliency to make sure there isn't slippage or that it's just all for naught. In South Africa, where so much hope came when Mandela rose to president, that country has descended into lots of political and economic troubles, and so it just needs to be constant. What's interesting is last year, immediately after the George Floyd murder and the protests that happened, there was a lot of recognition for Juneteenth, and now both houses of Congress have passed bills to make June 19th a federal holiday, which of course recognizes when slaves were finally freed in Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln. And in that very state, there are bills that are stifling conversations about racism, and that they're still celebrating Confederate Heroes Day in that state. And so that just during Martin Luther King week, as a matter of fact, I mean, it just doesn't, that's when there are words and there are words and there are, they're not walking the walk. We have so many instances of voter suppression and legislation working their way through state houses to restrict votes, and that fall hardest on communities of color, that it's mind-boggling to think that this is the 21st century. It's bound to be a combustible situation going forward for us. And on a foreign policy level, it weakens us, because if we can't get our race relations right, if we can't repair the image from January 6th because we're combating outright fictions in our civic society, then we cannot criticize with any kind of force the kind of crackdowns on freedom that China's making in Hong Kong right now.
Jim, I know we want to get to audience Q&A so everybody can get a chance to weigh in, but I was going to say a quick follow-up, but
sure, go right ahead.
So I think sometimes, Bill, that American exceptionalism prohibits us from learning some and internalizing some great lessons from some of our global neighbors who have also struggled with some of these issues. But whether it's social justice leaders at the community level, or whether it's our state and federal governments, what lessons do you think we can learn from previous movements, be it ending apartheid or the Arab Spring, especially because, as you pointed out, some of these movements started off great, and a decade or two or several on, those gains have been not lost but rolled back.
It takes a lot of coalition building, I think, and it takes the grit of people like John Lewis, and those inspirational leaders set the tone. But it also takes our businesses are responding to this. They're in the wake of George Floyd, even many world affairs councils that have been diversity minded, inclusive minded, equity minded, you know, created or strengthened statements. And we're having very deep discussions within our network about recruitment at the board level, staff hiring, the weekly newsletters that my office puts out to share 6 or 8 star speakers, as well as the long list of events that happen across 90 councils every week. I'm just bringing this home for a reason, is that we've seen a change, and we get criticized when we don't seem to reflect a certain change. It just so happened in March that I happened to recover from an illness and hadn't been in the office for a while, and had to bash out a newsletter, and I was presented with the star speakers, and they all looked good. Jim Mattis, John Huntsman, and on. And I got some feedback that, you know, all 6 or 8 of them are white and most of them are men. What's going on? How can you possibly highlight this? And I thought, my gosh, our record is fantastic over 52 weeks or, you know, 5 years, where we're really convening voices across all generations, communities of color, the experts in health, in economics, and in foreign policy. And I think if we continue the intentional mindedness in our small World Affairs Council way, businesses do, individuals and churches do, and we make coalitions with other organizations to highlight these values, that's how we sustain what has become a necessary movement.
That was very, very well said, Bill. I think, right, we all have to do our part. And by doing our part, we have to raise our voices. So let's go to hear some of the voices that we have here. We have a few questions. Mary asks the first one, and feel free, Nick or Karen, to weigh in as well on these. She asks, what or how do you convince elected folks from red states that the internet is part of the infrastructure of modern business, school, and indeed life, when Republicans don't seem to want to consider the internet as part of an infrastructure?
Did they not consider it part of the infrastructure? It seems like that's been more of a priority than a lot of other areas.
I think what she's referring to, you know, when the infrastructure plan was out there, right? Yeah, they may have wanted, that was the part they liked, but perhaps that didn't fit into the equation right. I don't know.
Well, there are 3 things happening in the online world, and I'm not sure this response goes to the heart of that question, but by not getting broadband into rural areas, you're not getting ideas and wealth into those areas. Now, I would have thought that was in the interest, because that's where there are certain voters who will support the money that would come in with that. There are also communities of color that lack access to the internet, and it may be that that is, given what we've seen elsewhere, a structural choice not to support their prosperity as well. Both of that is sad to me. I mean, they should have the gear that all of us have the access to, and that's that. The other things I see is there are, you know, countries that are taking advantage of our openness and flooding the zone with misinformation, and helping conspiracy-minded folks to amplify the damage done by falsehoods and all of that. That's not helpful, and there needs to be a mechanism. There needs to be governance in the technology companies have to self-police too a lot better than they have, or else there will be a a big brother saying you can't do this, and I don't think that's what our society wants. I think we would like to see a lot of responsible self-policing and a modicum of regulation.
Great. So Bill, Michael references you mentioning American values. And he says, particularly in the context of Biden's description of American values. While he agrees with you and our president, he also asks, can we safely assume any longer that these American values are shared by a large number of our citizens, which kind of goes back to some of the previous answers you've given, but please expand on that if you would.
I think something has to happen, and I hope it's not a terrible crisis that rallies this country and that enables us. I'd like to think that through education and a different kind of discourse in our media, that we can set common goals and pursue them in a way that we used to. Senator Vandenberg was an isolationist, and yet he became a huge force for bipartisanship in Congress. And he's your Michigander, right? And he, I think, had an awakening through the threat that the Soviet Union represented, and realized that there can be work across the aisle and straight talk to the American public. And in those times, we even when economically, I think there were divisions, there was a common sense around what our country stood for. Now, it's been, so many things have been peeled off that we have to re-examine our history. We have to re-examine what people are saying about 1619 and not feel threatened by that. This is just a conversation, and it's not trying to make people unpatriotic. It's trying, there have been arguments made in state legislatures that it would be harmful to, let's be honest, white kids' mental health if we talk about hard issues that led to slavery and Jim Crow and what we have today. We have to talk about this.
Could I add a point about our American values, and then as it applies to human rights? Again, I'm thinking about Russia and China. And, I think there has always been a gap between what we say and what we do. That's the reality. And so when, the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's always been distressing when you look at the reality of what that has meant in this country and abroad. But nevertheless, we wouldn't want to just chuck it out because it hasn't been completely fulfilled. And so if we take that same thing and look at, this is kind of what I was trying to get at for both Russia and China, like this is the 100th anniversary of Sakharov. If he would have lived, he would have been 100 years old this year. And one of the great human rights dissidents in the Soviet Union, and fast forward to today, and when we look at Navalny and we look at the other dissidents, it's actually more repressive in Russia today. There are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were then. But we need to talk about it. but we can't let the relationship end there, because the reality is we can't control what happens internally within countries. And if we think that we can, and if we have that hubris, it's just going to lead to a lot of bad outcomes for everyone involved. Some would even argue that the approach we've taken on dissidents in Russia has actually made it worse for dissidents, for individuals. But at the same time, through quiet diplomacy, we have been able to get some people released. So it's a mixed bag, but it's just something we have to acknowledge of how subtle all of these things are. And sometimes you need public rhetoric, but many times you need quiet diplomacy, and you need smart people, running the foreign policy, who know what to employ at any given time. And so that's American values too. But we just shouldn't be too confident that we can kind of tell other countries what to do. That's not going to get us very far.
Yeah,
And
and I think that goes right. Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to quickly add to Karen's point. At the same time, we have some fantastic examples from our global neighbors. I'm thinking specifically of Rwanda, but certainly other places where just incredible reconciliation has happened. Obviously, that was much closer to some countries shattering tragedy, and ours is more in the past, although really just right in the past, not that far behind. But I would love to see us looking more toward global examples, especially out of Africa and other places that we would sort of tend to overlook while trying to forge our own path.
And Nick, thank you, because I think that goes along with a question from Elizabeth, where she says she's in international real estate. They award sustainable projects worldwide. She asks, the world is so far ahead of us, it's embarrassing. What's holding us back? And I think that answer that you and Karen both speak of, that sort of best practices out there, why aren't we doing more of that? Why aren't we reaching out more than we are? So rhetorically, I'll just pose that question to any of you.
I think we have it's in our DNA to think that we can figure it out ourselves. I think it's prideful. I mean, our healthcare system has been exposed as wanting in this crisis. One of the practices, it's sort of, it's very private sector oriented, and that has worked for the United States. It has given us the best care in the world for some of the people. But in a global pandemic, it showed failings. We stockpile energy resources, right? We do not stockpile hospital beds. And when we think that in terms of global health security and the prospect that, this pandemic, a pandemic, was predicted. There were agencies built up by President Obama to ready for it, and they were taken away. And we can and should investigate the origins of COVID-19 in China and continue to send experts to study for the learning that comes in dealing with preparedness for the next pandemic. But we need to review our healthcare system. That's one best practice. Our roads and trains and bridges compared to countries in Asia. I've visited Europe, you know this as well as I do, that we're no longer the world standard there. Educationally, we may still be the world standard at the university level, but we have huge problems emerging in our university level education, and our K through 12 does not stack up with many countries. Health, infrastructure, education, there are more areas where we just are not world beating anymore.
Yes, so unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. I think we could go on for a few more hours with this, but I'm going to pose it to all three of you. And I think it's a great question from Jacqueline. And she says, has the UN lost its effectiveness?
I'm curious as to what the co-panelists think was the effectiveness of the UN in terms of, I think that certain agencies at certain times have been effective. And I think that bodies are imperfect, institutions are imperfect. And so, for example, the World Health Organization comes under some deserved criticism, and even from Donald Trump. Not to the point where you should exit the organization, though. The World Trade Organization comes under criticism. The United Nations comes under criticism. But I think there needs to be reform of perhaps the Security Council and other aspects of the UN. But to have a multilateral body that convenes regularly around issues like climate and peacekeeping and refugees, the world would be worse without it. So in that sense, it retains an effectiveness, but it's up to the nations to contribute financially and with responsible thinking.
Right. I would agree with that. I thought you put it beautifully. And it's another example of where the aspirations are obviously so different than reality. And that can be truly distressing. But when you look at what Truman, what he talked about in 1945, when the UN was founded in San Francisco, and those hopes for peace and for universal peace. But I agree with Bill. We have to have something that we strive for, but it's always going to fall short because ultimately we're human beings and we're extremely imperfect, and as political entities, we're corrupt and all sorts of things, and any organization is going to reflect that. But I also do agree that there are so many parts of the UN that we need. If we didn't have the UN, we would have to reinvent it today to find fora for getting together and talking, and yeah, using refugees as a excellent example. Who else would be doing that really hard work of vetting individual refugees, several of which we have right here in Traverse City, who have come through the unaccompanied minor program, and just individuals plucked out of horrible situations and have now made a beautiful home here. And it's a little teeny tiny example, but it's the sort of work that the UN does do in cooperation with other nations.
For all its messiness, it keeps issues on the table, and it is a connector, and the relationships that people develop there, ambassadors down to staff, and as they move through other institutions, those are really valuable.
We have to keep talking, and one thing that has bothered me through the pandemic is I feel like some of the divisiveness within the United States, it has been worse because we haven't been meeting face to face and talking. So I have people in my family who are Trump supporters, and when you get together with them, you realize, oh, they don't have horns. I don't have horns. You talk and you find other ways of that you can relate to each other, and that is only for the good. And yet for this whole past year, we haven't been talking to anybody. And so that sense of us and them, I think has been made much worse through this whole period. And we have to just keep talking with each other.
Thanks.
And over the past couple of decades, there's definitely been a trend of sort of abdicating responsibility to a super state entity like the UN. And they may have a shoddy track record on peacekeeping, but there have been some really incredible environmental impacts that have come out of the UN. I mean, when was the last time we heard about the hole in the ozone? We closed that through efforts largely led by the UN. And that might be an outlier, but it's not about what the UN does. It's about what starts at the UN and continues back home after those conversations.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Nick. We appreciate your insight regarding these important global topics. And I believe I can speak for all of us when I say we would certainly be interested in having each of you join us again sometime in the future to give your insight. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bill.
Okay. So right now, I just want to mention that we are extremely excited for our upcoming fall season. But before I reveal the lineup, I want to thank a few people who have helped make our 27th season successful, despite us having to be virtual essentially since May 2020. So first, I want to extend my thanks to the International Affairs Forum Advisory Board. These are a group of passionate, dedicated individuals who believe in the power of empathy, communication, and strategic diplomacy in helping to understand and find solutions to global problems. Next, I want to thank our former director, Ms. Layla Halal. And I took over from Layla in February, and since then, she has been nothing but helpful with any questions or concerns I have had regarding all things IAF. In fact, she even offered to share her understanding of the peace prospects in the Middle East with our student leadership team back in April. And as many of you know, and possibly tuned in to see, this past Monday, she joined retired diplomat Jack Segal for an excellent conversation on the recent activity between Israelis and Palestinians. So if you haven't seen that one yet, please check it out on our YouTube channel or our website. It's a great conversation. And then finally, I'd like to thank our International Affairs Forum Communication and Events Officer, Mr. Alex Tank. Alex is in the background today, as he usually is when we do a program, helping to run the technology and make this all work. And despite splitting his time between the International Affairs Forum and the NMC Extended Education Office, he uses his talents and energy to be a main conduit to all of you. His creative writing, attention to detail, and follow-up with members has been extremely valuable. So thank you, Alex. And finally, let me thank all of you who've tuned in to listen, question, discuss, and interact with our speakers. Your annual International Affairs Forum membership makes it possible for us to offer programming to K through 12 and college students, as well as unique opportunities for you, like the Global Hotspot pop-up presentations, and also student leadership team lunch break conversations with people like former ambassador to Indonesia, Blake, National Security Council spokeswoman Emily Horn, and others. So if you have yet to renew your membership, I encourage you to do so by the end of the month. And if you haven't become a member and would like to, please visit our website at tciaf.com. Subscribe to our e-news and our YouTube channels and join us for an engaging, thought-provoking season beginning in September. And now, let's take a look at who will be speaking with us this fall. First up, we have CNN Senior International Correspondent in the Middle East, Arwa Damon. So Arwa will be with us. She will be with us virtually, but we will be back in the Millikan Auditorium to host that. She is based in the Middle East and couldn't be here. Next, we have in October, Vanessa Acker, Political Unit Chief at the U.S. State Department Office of Russian Affairs. We talked about Russia today. We will talk about Russia again in October with Vanessa. So I look forward to seeing her here. And then in November, we have former Ambassador to Mexico, Anthony Wayne. Anthony will be talking about migration, trafficking, and trade. And as you know, a lot of the migrants, the refugees, are coming from the Northern Triangle in Central America up through Mexico. I think there'll be some excellent questions, excellent time to ask him these questions. Also, he will be a part of a November co-sponsorship with National Writers Series that we're doing that will focus on migrants and refugees. So we will have different events. We'll have two speakers, Ambassador Wayne, and National Writers Series will have an author regarding the topic of migration and refugees, displaced peoples, those kind of things. We will have a panel discussion. We're really looking forward to delving into that topic and really finding out not only what's happening worldwide, but also what's happening here in the Traverse City community with people that have moved here, people that have by no choice of their own have had to move here. So again, we look forward to that. So in addition to these folks, we'll also have global hotspot presentations. We'll probably do 1 or 2 of those, and possibly other events for you as well. So we are very excited about doing this. Our board's excited about doing it, and we look forward to continuing our conversation regarding international affairs and global problem solving. So with that, please watch for our biweekly e-news and feel free to contact us with any questions you may have. Thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care.